Welcome, Joti Brar, to Morbid Symptoms. I'm Tara van Dijk. Nice to meet you in person.
Thank you. Nice to meet
I've
you.
been anyway. To get right into it, the inspiration for why I wanted to have you on is there's this thing called the left. Does it exist? Hear about it all the time. There's the faux left and the real left and the far left and the center left and the Democrats and the Labour Party and the Green Party and the DSA and the this and that and the other. And I've heard that if your Marxism isn't for trans liberation, then you're not a good Marxist, or you're not a good feminist, or you're this and that and the other. And of course, Sultana, and I'm going to try to keep um, my examples UK based as much as possible. Anyway, so I reached out to Jodi and I'm like, can you come on and can we kind of start out like, what is this left? Is leftism keeping class politics behind and that type of thing? And I was really glad when you said, sure. So I know that you're Joti Brar. I know that you come from a communist lineage and that you're a member of the Communist Party, Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. And when you do your intro, if you could let our audience know why it's important, that why you guys felt the need to break away and add the Marxist-Leninist to your party.
So, yes, my name is Joti Brar. Yes, I was born to communist parents. It's not an automatic transition from having communist parents to being a communist. I have said to many people, and I say also to my children, there's no such thing as a reluctant communist, right? It's something you have to study for and become on your own. The head start that I had was I happened to be born to very good communists. And when I decided I wanted access to the knowledge they could give me, it was right there. I didn't have to spend decades, as so many people do, floundering around in the left, wading through all the wrong ideas to find the right ones. That was really lucky for me. I'm very appreciative of that. But yes, I am a communist. I joined the movement. So I grew up around the movement, but I joined it for myself just over 30 years ago. So I've been being a communist full-time as an activist, as well as a student of Marxism for just over 30 years without a break.
Whether communist.
It was an odd time to become a communist, and you can tell that I had good role models in that they doubled down on their Marxism at a time when everyone else was abandoning it. That's the legacy of my father, Joti Brar, is that in the 90s, as the Soviet Union was collapsing and in the aftermath of that, he became a pillar not only in Britain of Marxist theory of explaining that it was revisionism that collapsed, not socialism, that real Marxism-Leninism is still the key to our liberation as humans from capitalism, from imperialism. He wrote a series of really important books, first looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union and then looking at various other kind of key ideologies that get in the way of working class liberation, like social democracy, like Trotskyism, like bourgeois nationalism. So all of these very important aspects of the struggle, he was very acutely aware of, studied deeply, and had been active in the movement himself since mid-1960s, right? So party rests on a deep well of Marxist theoretical knowledge, but also practical experience. Of course, Apal and his close comrades, which included my mother when she was young, they were trained in the movement by people who were old in the movement themselves. So again, they're part of a kind of continuous legacy. We didn't just come out of nowhere. But so our party, the CPGBML, was founded 21 years ago, but it was the fruition of a lifetime's work, really, of my father and his close comrades. They had been in a very small organization of communists, but they had been involved in a lot of mass movements. So they were involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Zimbabwe Liberation Solidarity movement. They were involved in the women's movement in the late 60s, early 70s. They were involved in the anti-racist movement. My dad was a key leader of the Indian Workers Association for several decades. So they did mass work as well as kind of trying to build a real communist organization. It was a very difficult period to build a communist organization.
One of the things that I'm hoping to get out of this episode is that a kind of a guide to bourgeois versus proletarian left politics and ideas for the confused. And so before we get into more detail about why some of the things you mentioned are problematic or that get cobbled under this thing called the left or leftism have actually been counterproductive to the types of things that you were just talking about and the tradition that you come out of, communism, Marxist-Leninism, we should get the vocabulary out of the way. So revisionism, reactionary, And also, I think beginning for a good kind of axis, Trotsky or Stalinist.
So revisionism is basically a trend that has existed always within the Marxist working class movement. And it basically consists of people who, usually because they're actually aligned with the bourgeoisie in some way or another, want to revise the teachings of Marxism to make it more palatable to wider society, to the ruling class. And what it usually means is taking out the revolutionary content. So revisionism in the Soviet Union is particularly epitomized by Khrushchev, the actions and ideology that were promoted by Khrushchev after he came to power on the death of Stalin, which basically meant starting to dismantle the dictatorship of the proletariat. So you had rule of party, and the party became a separate elite from the rest of society. That wasn't how it was before then. There was a steady undermining of Marxist-Leninist education for the masses and a steady separation of the party from the masses. It stopped being their party and became a kind of ruling clique. There was a purging of the good Marxist-Leninists from the party during the Khrushchev period to facilitate this, enable this to happen. Economically, he started the beginnings of dismantling the socialist planned economy and bringing back commodity production to the Soviet economy, which was the beginning of creating the conditions for the collapse of the Soviet Union, which took a long time to collapse. If you think those first moves were being made in the mid-50s and the Soviet Union didn't collapse till 1991, you can see how much of a strong economy had been built before then. It was a slow process to undermine it. And key to all of this process, and this is something about revisionism generally, they always present what they're doing in the name of Marx. In the name of updating Marxism. Khrushchev used to say, oh, well, we've achieved everything we needed to achieve, and now we're just marching forward to full communism, And even, Gorbachev, when he was doing the last bit of dismantling of Soviet planned economy and Soviet proletarian democracy, did it all in the name of Lenin, right? So this is something that you see consistently, and it was something that we've been seeing really since the death of Marx. People using Marx's name to justify all kinds of aberrations and deviations from Marxism. So we call that revisionism.
Thank you.
No problem.
When you hear the left and the right, what gets placed is like all the internal contradictions and antagonisms and kind of hegemonic battles for, who's going to be the custodians of the legacy, how are we going to reinterpret the past theory and practice in terms of the present. There's always these battles going on that when we hear about the left or the right or the whatever, they get kind of all jumbled up, it's fair to say. I know that I've had that experience.
The ruling class does a good job of presenting a narrative about the communist movement, like these people just can't get along, they don't know how to agree, they're just split at the drop of a hat. In actual fact, a lot of the splitting has been a result of capitalist infiltration of our movement, which of course goes on all the time. It goes on by provocateurs, but it also goes on by a battle of ideas. It goes on through the vehicle of people's minds. We are all of us vehicles for bourgeois ideology because we've grown up in a bourgeois society and we are surrounded by bourgeois propaganda. So if you are not conscious of what is a bourgeois idea in your mind, and where spontaneously all kinds of ideas seem to arise in your mind that aren't that spontaneous at all, they are a reflection of the propaganda you're surrounded by. And that's why, the importance of studying, but also the importance of the group to be able to help you. If you're a sincere person, a sincere Marxist, you need sometimes help to recognize when you are getting attracted to wrong ideas because they become fashionable and they're in the air and they seem like a good idea. Fundamentally, we have to recognize Marxism is the science of the proletarian, the working class struggle. And we need it in order to win, in order to get rid of capitalism and imperialism and build socialism. And socialism is just the working class as the ruling class running society in its own interest without a class of parasites who basically sponge off all the wealth and keep the workers in misery. So it's a planned economy, which just means we work out what we need and how to produce it, and then we distribute it accordingly. So these are the basic foundations of what we're all about.
And if I could just flag something, somebody responded to the post I put out on X for our talk today and was pushing back on my thing is this left-right binary is problematic, but this person said, why would you push bourgeois and proletarian categories that have long since stopped being meaningful representations of the economy? And I just said, well, you should tune in tomorrow and I will definitely put that up at the front, because sometimes I forget that this will sound really 19th century or 18th century if we're talking about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So if you could say a bit about that to this person, that au contraire, these are still very meaningful categories that do reflect material processes in particular. Not to put words in your mouth, Joti.
No, 100%. I would really appeal to people who bought into the idea that this is all somehow something very historical to actually read Marx's Capital, read Lenin's Imperialism for yourself. They're perfectly approachable books. There's not some kind of mystique about them. You've been encouraged to feel like, there's a big barrier between you and that, precisely because the knowledge is so powerful. But what is a proletarian? A proletarian is someone who lives in the capitalist system and has no means of production with which to feed himself and his family, and therefore has to sell his labor power to an employer in order to eat, pay his bills, take care of himself and his family. So is that not most of us? If you sell yourself for a wage and you have no other way to feed yourself, and if you didn't have a pay packet for a couple of months, you'd be destitute, you are a proletarian, right? The bourgeois are the owners of the means of production, right? They are people who have enough access to enough capital that they can use that capital to employ others to make them still richer. That's the basis of the capitalist society. If you read Capital, you can get a fantastic lesson in how that developed, what it developed out of, and what it's developing towards. And that's one of the key importance of Marxist science, is it doesn't just show you the origins and the development and the workings of capitalist society. It shows you also the contradictions that capitalist production for profit creates and cannot solve. And it shows you the solution to those contradictions and the direction in which capitalist society is taking us, which is towards a planned economy, right? And the result of scientific investigation. So it's not some dreamers went, wouldn't it be nice if things were nicer? Wouldn't it be good if we were kind to each other, if the world was fair? It's a genuine, and again, I can't explain it all to you in a couple of sentences, but if you
No pressure, we're just on the amusement.
If you read Capital, you will see for yourself how it's a scientific, not just volume 1, but the writings of Marx in general show you that this is a scientific study and that Marx discovered scientifically laws which are operating within capitalist society, which capitalist society cannot overcome. You can't reform these laws out of existence. They are absolute laws in the operation of a society which is based on commodity production. That means producing things for sale on the market in order to realize a profit. That's the basis of the economics of our society. And we notice it when we look around. Nothing is done unless someone makes a profit out of it. It doesn't matter how much we need it. And we often rail against that. It's so it's unjust, it's unequal, our society. And all those things are true. But there's no point just complaining whilst trying to fix it inside the boundaries of capitalist society. And that's what Marxism teaches us, but it also shows us the solution. Hence, and as I was explaining, where my party came from, we are students of Marxism who've understood that. We've understood that it's the working class's job in history. Our historic role is to replace capitalism, which has done everything useful it can do for humanity and now just holds us back. It's the working class's job to replace capitalism and imperialism with socialism, with the planned economy, with the working class as the new ruling class. This is the job, the historic role of the working class. And in order to fulfill that task, it needs people who dedicate themselves to helping them understand that, to connect to studying Marxism and connecting Marxism with the mass of the working class so they can do the job that history has assigned to them, right? And so that is what we are. We are people who've dedicated our lives to that study and to that purpose. And there have been times, of course, we lived through the period of the fall of the Soviet Union when the bourgeoisie was very triumphant and telling everybody, communism's dead, it's over, it's a failed experiment. But increasingly, people are realizing that's not the case. All the contradictions of capitalism and imperialism are coming back. the workers and oppressed peoples have indeed, as Stalin predicted, he said back in the 30s, what would happen if the Soviet Union fell? He said the workers and oppressed peoples of the world would be seized by the throat. That's exactly what happened, right? We have had austerity and worse conditions, even for workers in the West, in the richest countries. In the rest of the world, they have had their national liberation struggles overturned. They've had war after war after war. It's very difficult for countries to attain and maintain sovereignty without being executed and strangled by the imperialists. Nevertheless, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. When we've known liberation, when people have known sovereignty, when people have the ideas in their mind that they need sovereignty and independence, they're going to keep fighting for them.
So do you think one of the problems is that if the most important division of class antagonism for capitalism is capital versus labor or bourgeois versus proletarian in terms of the politics and the mindset? Now, a lot of people, and I'm assuming this person, has a problem seeing themselves as like a factory worker or a logger or something like that. And when I was still in academia, what I would do is like, okay, well, everything in your room right now, or everything that you've used or consumed today, where did it come from? Both who made it. So there's the production and there's the realization, there's the distribution, all of that. And I think that some of us, because if everything that you need, you pay money for it, a commodity for it, you get alienated. And that would be why these concepts are literally like, well, I'm not a proletarian and I'm not bourgeois. So I guess we could talk about maybe in between phases, as I understand it, when I try to explain it to myself and others, is that you have the main structure, which is proletarian bourgeois labor capital within capitalism, that it's working itself out. So back and forth. But then you have things like the middle class, petit bourgeois, intellectual labor. Some people in the States really like to have this barista argument. It's barista producing value, productive versus unproductive value, these types of things. If you could speak to that, because I think maybe that's why people have a problem. They can't see, well, I'm not, Bezos, and I'm not working in the factory. So where am I in this?
So fundamentally, things get obscured because we live in an imperialist country, and an imperialist country which is so far into its decadent decay that very few of us any longer are engaged in productive labor. All around the world, people are engaged in productive labor and producing the goods that we're using every day, right? Probably all came from China.
Yeah.
But still, if you are a wage slave, if you need to sell yourself for a wage, right, as I said earlier, you are a working class, you are a proletarian. But there's a couple of caveats. So there is a class called the petit bourgeois. Petit bourgeois is someone who has a means of production, a small business, or back in the day, it was like a small farmer or a handicrafts person who had the tools of their trade and used them.
Podcasters.
Tools of their trade that they used to make profit, right? Those were petit bourgeois. So they're not exploiting somebody else, but they're also not selling themselves directly for wages. They're selling them products of their labor in order to live. So that's the classical definition of petit bourgeois. It used to be that the professional classes, which were very small because the number of people who could access the professional classes was tiny also, they kind of serviced the ruling class. They tended to be petit bourgeois. So if you were a priest, a lawyer, an accountant, or a doctor, you had a practice where you had your highly qualified trade and you plied it to the rich, and that you were kind of a petit bourgeois. Well, what we have now is, because of imperialism, we have the growth of something that he called the labor aristocracy. And that is a section of the working class. Yes, they're working for wages, but they're not working for minimum wages. And the reason really is that they are receiving a few crumbs from the table of imperialist super profits to give them quite a privileged existence. And they have a distinctly higher standard of living, higher wages than the bulk of the working class. So Lenin identified this in imperialist countries, a very distinct set of people who actually had different interests, because their better standard of living came via the super profits of imperialism empire around the world. They tended to be loyal to imperialism, and look down on the mass of the workers. Right? And what Lenin also identified was that the leadership of the working class movement around the turn of the century, if not earlier, had basically come under control of these people. And it's the reason we see consistently in imperialist countries that trade unions, anti-war movements, socialist parties are all being led by people who fundamentally don't want to challenge the capitalist system and the imperialist system. And they keep the working class under control, and they make sure that their activity doesn't lead to anything truly disruptive. And fundamentally, it's why our parties did a lot of work on this, on the Labour Party's role as a party of imperialism, right? It's sold to us as the party of the working class. Lenin characterized the Labour Party back at the time of its earliest formation as a bourgeois Labour Party. And what he meant by that was, it doesn't matter what its mass membership is made of. That doesn't prove that it's a working class party. What would prove it was a working class party would be if it had working class ideology guiding its program. And he said the Labour Party has a thoroughly bourgeois program. You can put as many flat hats in the leadership as you like and as many coal miners in the membership as you like. It's a bourgeois party for the bourgeois system. And that's something that really confuses people. So let me just get it out there now to frame our discussion. This left-right paradigm and kind of spectrum that we are presented with, very neatly curated to us, is the left to the right wings of bourgeois politics. Proletarian, working class politics, the pursuit of our own class interests, is outside of that paradigm. It's not inside, it doesn't fit in it. And that's why also it's not covered, right? You never will see my party getting referenced on the BBC. What they present to you as extreme left is Trotskyism. And they're right, Trotskyism is the extreme left of bourgeois politics. Right? So this is something that's very important to understand. They all serve the imperialist capitalist system, extreme left to extreme right. They all have the same ultimate program, which is save British imperialism. That's something that has to be recognized. So a lot of the differences are very much cosmetic. They're kind of to keep you on side with some team that's been presented in such a way that you feel that you identify with it. You know, the right
Filtered coffee.
Yeah, all of that. And cultural differences, which are not really very deep differences when you kind of scratch the surface, but you're encouraged to feel are really different. The same way, you know, people from towns next door to each other are encouraged to feel like they're rivals and really different from each other when they're basically the same.
Okay, Joti, so you mentioned imperialism, and let's define that. My understanding is that the main export of the UK is capital that invests around the world, and they want a return on that investment. So a lot of the foreign policy, and that affects the local policy, is about protecting that investment. They want to make sure they get as much return as possible, which of course, I imagine that has something to do with the foreign policy in Greater Israel and Ukraine, maybe.
So imperialism means war. There's no way around it. When you say they want to protect their investment, you're absolutely right. But it's not like protect it as in the whole point of export of capital is to raise profitability because the home market has become saturated. The home market becomes saturated because the people have been impoverished. You've been expanding production and impoverishing the working class. That's how our capitalism works. And at a certain point, you have a problem, which is you're producing all these goods, but the poor workers can't buy them off you. So you need to expand. And profitability gets lower and lower in a kind of contained economy. The reality is there was never a contained economy for the whole of capitalist period. You have to expand. You have to find new markets. For 200 years, the capitalists in Britain, they had the first systemic overproduction crisis of capitalism in 1820. And that crisis has been recurring every 10 years pretty much ever since. And each time, part of the strategy for bringing back profitability was expansion. And it was expansion outside the borders of, but find new markets, find new people to sell our stuff to, right? Well, then you have a global market at a certain point, and the global market's saturated, and the global people have got too poor to buy your stuff. So they stopped just exporting goods, and they're constantly looking for ways to bring back profitability. And one of the ways is to get people in poorer countries to make the stuff in the first place, because their wages are lower, the prices of land and raw materials is cheaper. So what happens is you take the capital you've amassed at home, you take it to Indonesia or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Vietnam or wherever it is. You set up your factory there. You employ local workers. You control the government so they're not taxing you and they're not requiring that you take care of the environment when you're, doing your industrial processes and poison the land and the rivers and the air, and no one can stop you, right? And you can put the workers there on absolutely pittance slave wages for the local level of existence, which is lower, maximizes your profits. So the whole point about imperialism is maximum profit. And then you bring that wealth. So the local people created all that wealth for you, and you bring it back home. They make it to stay in poverty. And your whole policy is about making sure they stay in poverty. Don't let them unionize. Don't let their governments get independent, because they'll start holding you to account. They'll want some of that wealth for themselves. You don't want to give it to them. A big part of it is controlling sources of raw materials. And again, the imperialist economic imperative is get those raw materials for as cheap as possible, preferably for nothing. What is all the wars in the Middle East are because oil is the most important global commodity. And to control supplies of oil means not just that you make a fortune because it's so important, but also you can stop other people from having access to it, right? Which is also kind of imperative of the imperialists, is to try to choke rivals by denying them access to vital materials.
Well, and just the hypocrisy, it's talked about in great ways: human rights, development, overseas investment, all this stuff. And I'm sure it's not all diabolical, but the Congo is not oil rich, but it's very rich in all the stuff we need for all these, everything that I'm using right now, all the tech stuff and the batteries. And that's a war-torn place with warlords. But for whatever reason, everybody who we would put under the left, the kind of NGO, professional, managerial, inclusive, diversity, all that stuff, and the feminists don't say blip really about the Congo, but they're all about Afghanistan.
You don't have to, because it's almost not in the news. And this is one of the ways bourgeoisie controls things. Now, if workers in Britain had more direct connections with workers in Congo and were seeing feeds like we're seeing from Palestine of what's happening there, it would be much harder for the ruling class to keep the lid on its crimes, but to look between the difference between genocide in Congo and genocide in Palestine and how they're perceived by workers. You see, with Congo, you see the same pattern that the ruling class has had for centuries, which is simply hide information about what they're up to abroad, and the mass of people just don't know. And when the mass of people don't know, then the leadership of their movements can turn a blind eye and nobody's going to call them out on it. Right? I actually was part of a group, even before we founded our party. We were in the SLP those days, Socialist Labour Party, with Arthur Scargill, which we were in for quite a few years. Then at the time of founding our party, we were working with a Congolese comrade trying to found a Congo solidarity campaign in Britain, in London initially. We could not get any interest from the wider left. They did not want to know. And already in that time, we were talking about, the genocide of 4 or 5 million people in the just in the latest phase of, what you talked about, the Coltan Wars, essentially. Well, somebody dubbed them the PlayStation Wars, right? The war that was ravaging Congo so that the imperialists could get their coltan basically for nothing. And, the left didn't want to know because there was no demand from the wider masses because it wasn't in the papers. So you do this ballet. If the wider masses start to become aware of something and outraged about it, then their leaders and some of the papers have to reflect it a little bit so as not to be totally exposed. If the mass of the people are totally unaware of something, then their leaderships will be complicit in keeping quiet about those things.
Yeah, and I think it's also, this is maybe a confession on my part, kind of out of sight, out of mind. And we love all our devices. I don't want to get too far off into this, but just kind of the laundering, or I guess this would call what Marx would say, we're kind of ruled by abstractions. I go to the store, I buy this lovely product, I have a great experience, I come home, I'll look at the packaging, and maybe they say, 1% of the profits go to helping Ecuadorian coffee farmers. And I think, you're allowed not to know. Everything is kind of encouraging you not to look too carefully about the history behind these products that for a lot of us, we can't even imagine being gone, even though I'm a Gen Xer, so I had spent most of my life without a cell phone and whatnot. Do you think that's part of just the guilt, especially when it comes to the stuff in our devices?
I think we are deliberately kept inside a kind of bubble of, on the one hand, kind of isolation, and on the other hand, distraction. So it's very, very difficult for workers who grew up in Britain and whose parents were British to really understand what is imperialism, because they haven't experienced it. They've lived inside all their life inside this protective bubble. They've been told, they've been raised with a kind of supremacism that expresses itself in very nice ways, church do-goody type of ways, but fundamentally has taught them, so that they just feel it in their bones, that their society is just a bit civilized and people around the world are a bit incapable of being properly civilized. And those messages are given to us so many different ways. And all the problems of the world, if we're exposed to them, it's in this kind of like, as if Britain was a innocent, helpless, a sad bystander to terrible tragedies. And who knows why it is people do such silly things around the world, like they're always fighting and they're always poor and they seem to be very corrupt, and it's a shame, and let's have a charity drive and, send them slippers or whatever. There's a total disconnect. And this is where the destruction of a decent communist movement really comes in, because without the communists, you don't have anybody helping to break this kind of information wall and cut through the distractions of the bubble. And even though people are now becoming much more angry and much more aware of how many things are wrong with this society, it's still very hard for real communist voices to cut through, because we are deliberately kept separate. We are suppressed on social media. It's very hard for people to find us, we're not invited into the media. We're not mentioned. In fact, there's a deliberate policy of not mentioning the name of our party in mainstream media. And when I say mainstream media, I'm actually including alternative left media. Well, officially left out, excluded from the official left, right? There's no Palestine solidarity campaign, big meeting or rally that's going to invite me to speak on the platform. Although we are the best anti-Zionists in the country, right? There is no war platform or conference that's going to invite me to speak on its platform. Although we are the best anti-war activists in this country. We're the ones that got an actual program for the working class that tells them what they could actually do to stop a war, what they could do to stop the genocide. We're deliberately excluded from access to the mass platforms and the mass audiences so that people could hear what we've got to say. So we have to fight very hard. And consequently, ordinary workers have to struggle hard to find us. So it's both directions for us to come together. Nevertheless, we find that our influence is growing, because in the end, the truth comes out, right? And I just wanted to come back before I forget it. You were talking about how there seems to be constant struggles inside parties, inside the left, for kind of whose line comes on top. Something that really has to be borne in mind about all politics, but particularly in Marxist politics and working class politics, is every trend inside the party actually has a class interest behind it. The key to understand, so people come from all backgrounds into the party, and they will bring with them a whole load of prejudices that they picked up. And the skill of building a good Marxist movement is to be able to recognize the class interests that a certain line represents. Now, what we have that really helps us in these days is this job has been done for us by very intelligent people over many decades and even centuries. So what you will tend to find is very often a line that's presented to you as something really new and exciting, and this changes everything. If you've studied enough Marxism, you discover that it's a repackaged version of something we've seen before. So like green politics were basically, when they were shown to us as, this is a big new thing, actually it turned out to be repackaging of somebody who Marx dissected and took apart ideologically back in of the 19th century. So if you study enough, you're able to recognize how old wrong ideas, which smuggle bourgeois ideology into the working class movement, are being constantly repackaged for new people who haven't come across them before to be confused by.
Oh, and now it came to my mind, because I know that, of course, Capital Volume 1 and Lenin's book on imperialism, but I wanted to say also the Grundrisse, because you mentioned Proudhon, and the Grundrisse is a great read because Marx will cut a Mitch, so to speak. when he's critiquing people like Proudhon and whatnot, it's funny how he really, and also some of his journalistic writing, it's like, whoa. He was very critical of genres of socialism back in the day. But as I understand it, at least when the Marxist party is running well, you don't tend to have as many guns pointed at each other's backs. Okay, so it's a leftist, and there's a leftist behind a leftist with the gun, and there's a leftist behind that leftist with the gun, and then there's a leftist from the balcony pointing at all the leftists with another gun. So just backstabbing and complaining.
Invariably, what you find is that a revolutionary movement gets infiltrated by the forces of imperialism, and then internecine warfare breaks out. And we've seen that in many countries and many movements, and it's always tragic. Yeah, that side I think just comes back to what I was saying earlier, which is the class struggle exists inside the party as much as it exists in society. The party itself a microcosm of society, which is trying to build a disciplined working class organization out of members of society. And the class struggle, the struggle for the right line that's going to lead to success, going to lead to revolutionary transformation of the society, is a hard struggle. And it goes on, as I said, inside the party. If you read the works of Lenin, more than half of it is directed at wrong trends inside his party and inside the International Communist Party. And that's not because he was just some kind of bad-tempered,
my way or the highway.
It's because he was a real scientist of Marxism who really was determined to help the Russian people achieve socialism. And he was exposing in the eyes of the workers, as well as in the eyes of people in the party who were wavered and weren't sure, why all these people were selling them lies, telling them ideas that would lead to defeat, right? So those wrong ideas have to be exposed in order for the working class to take the right path and win. And if you're not just a faker and a poser, of course, if you're serious about winning through to socialism, you've got to take this fight seriously. The class struggle is a very serious struggle. And sometimes it takes the form of words. In fact, most of the time it takes the form of words and ideas and helping to educate people in how to spot which are the ideas which are going to serve them and which are the ideas which are there to distract and derail their struggle.
Okay, and thank you, Jodi. One clarification I wanted to ask, or not ask, but make clear. It goes back to people who hear this, the bourgeois proletarian binary, class conflict, class structure. To realize that you don't have to be an actual proletarian to have a proletarian politics. I mean, Marx wasn't a proletarian. I don't know the whole thing. He had an Engels. Engels had money. Engels helped him out, But to make clear that you don't have to be an actual proletarian in your day or night job to have a proletarian politics, or vice versa. You can work for wages and have very little control over what you do and how, either at work or in the broader economy that you live in, and have bourgeois politics.
Well, there are class companies in the ranks of every class, but there are also core class interests. The core class interest of the bourgeois is to keep the capitalist system going so that they can carry on exploiting. The core class interest of the proletarians is to overthrow capitalism and establish socialism, right? So proletarian politics are socialist, revolutionary socialist politics. Bourgeois politics is everything which keeps the capitalist system going. Proletarian politics are the politics of humanity, and humanity's future can come to anybody. And in fact, the science of Marxism was created by a bourgeois intellectual because, and he said it himself, this theory is necessary for the effective class struggle of the workers, but the workers are not in a position to produce this theory because it requires a level of education that's not available to them. Right? So initially, proletarian ideology came into the movement from outside, from intellectuals like Marx and Engels. What happened then was it was embraced by the most class-conscious workers, and we got this thing which we called worker intellectuals, right? So working class people, once the theory had been provided to them, could pick it up, could study it, could take it on board and use it. It could empower them in their lives and in their work. So now, when we have the important work of Marxism has been done for us, and our job is to use it for our struggle, we don't have to have a separate strata of intellectuals doing that work for us. Any worker, especially in the modern world where we all read, we're not in the days of Marx when a huge section of the working class was illiterate. It's all about motivation, to be honest with you, determination. Of course, there are barriers It takes a lot of effort, but it's worth it because it embodies truth and it's so powerful. But you can identify yourself with the cause of the proletariat from any class background, of course. And as you say, there are plenty of people in the ranks of the proletariat who unfortunately identify themselves with the ruling class, who think of themselves, and my brother likes to say this, as if, and it's particularly common in America, how many workers have imbibed this idea of the American dream, that they are, despite their poverty, they're just kind of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And any day now they can make it, and therefore the system's there for them.
Yeah, also people who are homeowners think they're capitalists or something. And it's great if you have your home outright, but a lot of people have a mortgage, but still it's this idea that, again, I think that's part of the buy-off is the ownership society. People become very concerned about the resale value of their home. And that kind of aligns them with like, oh, I have the same concerns as, BlackRock.
Well, I've got to stay. It's very illusory, isn't it? This little tiny bit of property, even if you manage to pay off your mortgage, it's still very insecure. So you get old and, you need care, and you might have to sell that home, liquidate some money to pay for your care costs because you own a home. The government will say, well, we're not paying your costs. You've got money. So in actual fact, people scrape and save and try to pay exorbitant prices just for the privilege of having a roof over their heads and feeling like they've got a stake in the system because they own something. But, usually what they own is a debt to the bank. And when that's paid off, they get to a point where then they start to have to liquidate it, either so that their kids can have deposits for somewhere to buy because they can't possibly save a deposit because it's too impossible, or to pay care costs. So actually, it was just a way of keeping you busy your whole life and making you feel like you were building something that in fact wasn't yours at all.
Yeah, and I'll just flag for people that under Joti's name, you can see the communist.org. You can check that out for more meat on the bones of what she's talking about. And also, she's had 2 recent podcasts on Savage Minds, and you can go to Proletariat TV. And I think you do a regular show with Garland Nixon, current imperialism of it all, and the wars and whatnot. Cover things like communists are not against you having a home, and this has dispelled the myths and smearings. So I would encourage people to go check that out because I'm not going to make her go through all of that again at this point. So this is what I'd like to do in the next, I think we have about an hour, give or take. Start off with some things that really distinguish which people in policies and institutions are proletarian or bourgeois. So the first thing that gets thrown around the real left is NATO. Can you be a proletarian in former content and F with NATO, so to speak? Would you say? Like Paul Mason, Ukraine thing has divided the quote unquote left, whatever that is. So is NATO in any way a proletarian vehicle, even accidentally?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
My father used to describe NATO as a neo-Nazi alliance. It's an aggressive instrument of war that is wielded by the collective West to keep the rest of the world in line in order to keep maximum profit flowing to the owners of finance capital. That's its job. It exports violence and genocide all over the world. There is no aspect of NATO that is in any way progressive or proletarian.
All right. So why do so many people have the Ukrainian flag who would say they're left or trend left or really left, but Putin, Russia.
Essentially, what they're showing is the co-optation of the leadership of the working class movement by bourgeois politics, and how in the West, the labor aristocracy is so tied to the interests of imperialism that they will cheerlead for the interests of imperialism almost louder than the ruling class themselves. Right? They are desperate to prove their loyalty. And this goes all the way back to 1924. The very first Labour government was only in power for about 8 months, but it was almost like a trial run where the ruling classes was kind of, all right, give it a go, let's see what happens. And minister after minister at the top of that administration said openly, we want to show that the empire is safe in our hands. This very first 1924 Labour government, that was explicitly what the leaders of that government were saying. The empire is safe in our hands. So this is why our party has always made clear that the Labour Party is one of the chief enemies of the working class, because it's like the wolf in sheep's clothing. It's easy to know that the Tories hate you. right? It's not very easy for workers to realize that Labour and Tories are basically the same thing with different branding. They're both mechanisms for maintaining the class rule and the imperialist interests of the British imperialist ruling class. The monopoly capitalists were sending their money abroad, as you said, and getting their returns. And Russia is an impediment to British finance capital and American finance capital because it insists on sovereignty. It's this huge territory full of people and resources that the imperialists want to hyper exploit and loot. And Russia has the cheek to say, well, we'll happily be your partner on the world stage. And the imperialists are like, you haven't understood this relationship. You're supposed to be the servant, right? And the Russians are like, we're very happy to trade with you. And the imperialists are like, we don't want to trade with you. We just want your stuff, right? And there's this, the Russians are like, well, why can't we all just get along? And the imperialists are like, you don't get this relationship, right? And fundamentally, and you have to see all of this as well. It's not like it's business as usual in one sense, but there's also a bigger driver, which is that the global monopoly capitalist economy is in a massive, massive global crisis. Desperate to save the system, which is teetering on the brink of a massive meltdown that will put 1930s in the total shade. And they're trying to find ways to restore profitability, to make a quick buck. And it's got to be a big quick buck. What they want is the looting frenzy they got at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, which again rescued the imperialist global capitalist system from a deep crisis it was in the 1980s, right? Rescued from that, they got like what I call a shot in the arm from looting the collective wealth of the socialist bloc, former socialist bloc. They want to do that again with Russia. Russian government and people are standing in their way. So this is the origin of all this Russophobia that we see in our society. It's not a kind of endemic thing that Russians and English can't get along. And it's not that, there's something awful about Russians. It's literally the present Russian government stands in the way of imperialist looting. And not only does it stand in the way of their looting of the vast territory and resources and peoples of Russia, but Russia is also acting because of the position it found itself in, where it's been like, well, we're not socialist anymore. Why are you still targeting us? Yeah. They're like, we don't want to be a colony. Well, you have to be a colony. So they're like, oh, well, to be sovereign, they need allies. Increasingly, to bolster their position and keep the majority of the world's people and countries on their side, and also to keep their people motivated and mobilized for the war against NATO that's been forced on them in Ukraine, they are leaning more and more into their Soviet past, which means giving help and support to nations around the world who ask for it on a fraternal, friendly basis, not an exploitative basis. They're not new imperialists. They've made themselves hated to our ruling class because of that, because they're getting in the way of imperialist domination, not only of Russia, but of other parts of the world too. They're helping other sovereign countries stay sovereign or get and defend themselves. So, of course, the imperialist ruling class hates them, targets them, wants to bring them down, and is obsessed about bringing them down. But you see how the Labour aristocracy is so aligned with the system that they take on the hates of their rulers almost more vociferously than the rulers themselves. But never find a Labour aristocrat, name, they have allowed themselves to fall for, or they justify their position. I mean, some of them are part of manufacturing this nonsense. Some people just fall for it because it sounds convincing. Other people are working in the machinery of manufacturing this nonsense narrative, which tries to say that Russia is a new aggressive imperialist power in the world. And they use the terminology of socialism and hide behind it. But, if you imagine that NATO is out there to defend countries that are being aggressed against by imperialist powers, you've been living on a...
Promoting free speech and freedom of association. And voting. You can vote as long as you vote right.
Yeah. So they use the aspirations and the sentiments of working people, which are against war, which are against imperialism and domination, which want fairness for countries and for peoples. Fundamentally, we have, all of us as workers, in fact, imbibed a lot of socialist principles since the October Revolution happened in Russia in 1917, to the point where when the imperialists are doing their dirty deeds, back in the early 20th century, they would openly say what they were up to because they were just superior and better. Since World War II, all the imperialist machinations, they've had to present them in a narrative as if they're good socialists, right? We want to free women. We want equal nations. They wrap everything up in the terminology of the oppressed and the aspirations of the world's majority. But increasingly, it's wearing very thin, isn't it? Their hypocrisy becomes more and more evident.
Okay, and on that note, the UN. What role does the UN play in this kind of post-World War II late-stage imperialism system? Is there anything proletarian about the UN in former context?
In form, there was something progressive about the founding of the UN, which was basically the result of the balance of forces after World War II, which was essentially that there was this rising socialist world. The socialists defeated the fascists in World War II. There was a rising socialist world. And the imperialist world had to reckon with this. The imperialist world was very shaken. Apart from US imperialism, every other imperialism was either almost totally destroyed or on its knees, right? Only American imperialism had the strength to resuscitate and prop up the rest of the imperialist powers, which it did to make it look to the world's people as if there was an international community of families and not just one dominant imperialist power, right? So they sort of, in the interest of keeping global capitalism going, they kind of helped to resuscitate imperialist powers otherwise like France and Germany, which essentially had been defeated by the course of the war. So you had that post-World War situation of a rising socialist camp. And because of that, the imperialist camp was on the back foot. They were having to make huge concessions to their own workers in terms of the welfare states and housing and education, all these things, to buy off the revolutionary sentiments of their people and keep capitalism in place, because otherwise it was just going to be socialist revolution all across Europe. That was the mood of the masses at that time. So they were on the back foot. And the balance of class forces globally and the advance of socialism meant that the United Nations Charter had to codify a whole load of principles which were the demands of the colonized and the oppressed. Now, the truth is that the United Nations has never, ever been an instrument for implementing its own charter. But the charter exists. And increasingly what you'll find is as anti-imperialist powers grow in influence in the world again, they endlessly point to the UN Charter and the gap between the UN Charter and the realities in the world, and the fact that basically US imperialism has a total veto over any action by the UN. So all the actions of the UN have actually been aggressive actions. They were giving a United Nations cover to imperialist wars, where they haven't been able to get cover through the UN for their wars. They've just gone outside the UN and done it anyway, coalition of the willing, etc. Right? The Soviet Union walked out of the UN at the time of the launch of the Korean War because it became clear that the UN was not going to be able to be used to arbitrate in a proper way and resolve this dispute, that the imperialists had got enough control of the structures to be able to use it and manipulate it. It wasn't an honest forum. So they walked out, and as a result, the Korean War was waged under a United Nations flag, and 14 countries were able to be corralled under the US's banner to invade and genocide in Korea between 1950 and 1953. So the United Nations essentially is a tool of US foreign policy. It gets most of its money from the USA. It lives in the USA. So the USA can gatekeep who can come and go from the UN. The USA can bug everybody who works at the UN and pressure them and blackmail them and do all kinds of things to them. And the USA can veto anything it doesn't want through the UN. So fundamentally, it is not a proletarian institution, but the UN Charter has been a useful propaganda tool in the hands of the oppressed to say, look, you agreed to all this, you signed up to all this, and it helps them to expose the hypocrisy, modern imperialist way of conducting their aggressive war, to pretend they're doing it to protect people rather than just the naked interest and profit.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing that's gone on in my country for a long time. People will be like, well, look at this fine document. Declaration of Independence, Constitution. Hey, what about us ladies? What about us African Americans? What about us this, that, and the other? So yeah, I'm not going to say that the founding fathers were proto-socialists. Like that. So human rights. In terms of bourgeois proletarian form and content, I think this one's a bit more dicey, although the critique of them is not that it's very based in liberalism. And again, gets used as a cover for all kinds of things like humanitarian wars and interventions and humanitarian sanctions and humanitarian bombing and things.
If your definition of human rights does not include the right to a job and a home and the right to live free from exploitation, then they're not human rights. It is just hypocrisy. And it's a propaganda cover for capitalism, and to pretend to fool people into believing that there's a way for capitalism to deliver fairness, equality, kindness, dignity. What are all these things here? Peace, dignity, rule of law, and prosperity. Prosperity for whom? Capitalism cannot deliver prosperity to masses because it impoverishes the masses in order to enrich the few at the top. So this is just a con trick, right? But it's also, it's the mantle that the ruling class has taken on itself, like I said, as a cover for its really genocidal and barbaric control and looting of countries all over the world. And I think we have to be very grateful to people like Netanyahu and the Banderaists in Ukraine for pulling the mask off and showing us what is the true content behind all of these hypocritical words.
Well, and also you could have fascist human rights. You could have, of course, bourgeois human rights. You could have, I don't know, child sacrifice cult human rights. So what I mean is that there's some sort of master term or signifier that gives meaning to all these things. I've been thinking a lot about this. I don't want to get too far off track. Might have to have you back to get into the proletarian versus bourgeois feminism. But whenever I'm pushing back on imperialism, a feminist typically will pop up and be like, you don't care about women's rights in Iran. You don't care about women's rights in Afghanistan. You don't care about this, that, and the other. And to get back into just the education of it, and this woman probably meant well. I don't want to get too long, but all the stuff that's come up, unsurprisingly, since the Gaza thing kicked off, the genocide kicked off, about the plight of the Afghan woman. Yeah. And I was like, well, the best thing you can do if you're in the West is to tell the powers that be to leave Afghanistan alone so they can sort this out.
Right.
And also, sorry, not sorry, the Taliban doesn't give a crap what you think about their gender policies. I'm not a big fan, assuming all of it's true. But this woman said, we're just trying to raise awareness and to raise the voices, this kind of white women's or Western feminist burden. So the UN, and this literally is a quote, so the UN will do something.
Do what?
Yeah.
So, there's two sides to that, aren't there? One is this seeing, and it's a very chauvinist mindset that, as you say, the white man's burden, white woman's burden approach that says, these victims need me to speak for them. And that's how their problems will be solved. So it's seeing the world like your Lady Bountiful dispensing charity, right? People don't need charity. They need liberation. Now, the liberation for the women of Afghanistan is twofold. And the first and most urgent part is getting the imperialists out, because dealing with the local problem is much less of a difficult battle. And in order to create the conditions for the women to be emancipated, you first have to lift off the thing that's holding everybody down. And then what you actually have to recognize that Afghan women aren't so bloody stupid, because they actually had that until the Americans came, the beginning of a socialist republic in Afghanistan. And women's rights were flowering and blossoming in the mid-1970s in Afghanistan. And you can see photographic evidence of that. And it was the USA who brought in, paid for and developed extremist Muslims of the type who didn't exist in Afghanistan before, right? They created this Wahhabist type of fundamentalist movements, armed them, they made them into big movements where before they'd been like, just kind of Jehovah's Witnesses wandering around knocking at people's doors.
Well, yeah, the Mujahideen, Osama bin Laden, and then you had al-Jilani, and Jilani is like the reverse bin Laden, right? So bin Laden first was like a freedom fighter. He's great. He's fighting the communists or whatever, and then became a terrorist, and we know his fate. And then you have Jilani, started off with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and now is the leader of Syria, whatever that is, and shaking hands with all the fine civilized people like Mark Rubio and I'm sure you saw the pictures. So I just wanted to flag that in terms of these things that seem new and crazy.
Both of those are, were tools of imperialist policy. in both of their incarnations, whether they were being terrorists or whether they were being freedom fighters or leaders. They were serving imperialist ends every time. And just to come back to the question of women, fundamentally, you need to study Marxism to understand that the real liberation of women, including the massive working class women, can only come about through the ending of class society, which means if you really care about women's rights, you've got to join the fight for socialism. Not go around the world saying, oh, I've got freedom and those poor women over there don't, right? You're obviously coming from a position of privilege here in Britain. Reality is massive working class women still suffer, even in the West, where we officially have all of our rights, under the double burden, class exploitation, but also because as women, we are expected to do a whole load of unpaid labor in the home for the family, raising children, caring, and it keeps us under an extra burden. We're providing social services without support, in fact, being penalized for the fact that society relies completely on all this labor that women for free, and they have to be kept in their place, so they keep doing that. Right? It's only socialism that can change that situation. The origins of women's oppression go right back to the very earliest class societies. They didn't begin with capitalism. They began with the slave-owning society, actually. When men became the owners of private property, they also became the owners of their women. Right? And this has a long, thousands of years history, and it's only socialism that can finally resolve it. And that is why anybody who really wants to liberate women should join the communist movement, the socialist movement, the struggle for a new socialist class-free society.
Yeah. As important as the burqa is to feminists, first things first, and in terms of the women question, bourgeois or imperialist feminism, they'll be like, oh, we just want women to have more choices. But usually what that means is a choice is a choice, and a good choice if it's the choice I would make. And they keep on making these wrong choices, and supporting their men and not wanting to forsake, the most terrible cultures on earth from the point of view of J.K. Rowling. Anyway, so I want to get through a bit more of the rubric for positioning ourselves, a policy, a person, a party, a trajectory in terms of completely bourgeois, completely proletarian, or something in the mix. And we already talked about the left and how it's a very contradictory entity. Oddly enough, we have a left anti-communism. Communists, socialists, or Marxists, that's also maybe talk about how those things go together. In the West, after World War I, came under increasing pressure. Then, of course, after World War II and the Cold War, and in France, for example, 1968 was a big watershed moment. And you have a big divide between communism and anti-communist left, as well as, which I think probably goes along with an imperialist to anti-imperialist left.
So again, I would distinguish between bourgeois left and real proletarian politics. And I think one of the difficulties we have is that in the bourgeois narrative, these are constantly conflated, but if you're really understanding the spectrum of politics, I would say that our party is outside of that, because we see the whole of this left to right spectrum as representing the enemy class. And we are representing the mass of the working class, even if they don't yet know it and haven't yet identified themselves with us. We know from our study of Marxism and our understanding of history and everything else that we are representing the real interest of the working class, in contradistinction to this entire gamut of left to right, bourgeois, petit bourgeois political spectrum. So there's that. When people look at this, what they think of as the left, and they see this whole mess of, essentially most of what they think of as left is left liberal. And liberalism is the ideology of the capitalist class. It's the ideology of the individual. It's the ideology of individual self-actualization. The left liberals, actually take this to extremes, whilst simultaneously having a kind of socialist sense that things should be fairer, right? But they try to solve the problem of the unfairness and inequality, which is endemic, intrinsic to capitalist production relations. They try to find a solution to that inside the bounds of the system that creates that unfairness. And they try to find an individual solution to these problems. If I have equality before the law, if I have equal opportunities, but you can't really have equality even before the law, because the law is a biased instrument. And if you have more money, you have more access to the law. And if you have no money, you have no access to the law, right? Like with medicine and loads of other things. There's this illusion that the bourgeoisie propagates amongst the workers that they have choices that they don't really have. When people are talking to you about choice, do I have the choice to go and earn a living? It's like, well, you have the choice to be employed by somebody, to audition and get somebody to employ you and exploit you, or you can starve in a ditch. Okay, that's right? Not really much of a choice.
My son is 19 and he's trying to find a job. He still has the home safety net. So if he really hates something, he'll just be like, I don't want to go, He tried McDonald's for a while, etc. But minimum wage jobs, even them, they want, 2 or 3 references. They want to screen you. They want to give you these tests and all for the privilege of working at a fast food restaurant or a warehouse. I'm not poo-pooing on that stuff. But it's just this idea that there's jobs aplenty. And anytime I want a job, I can just go out and get a job. It's a good match for me. I don't know. I just wanted to throw that in there. Even a basic entry-level job, they want all this stuff. And no one can say like, well, F you. Why do I have to jump through all these hoops?
Well, no, you have to. You don't have a choice for that. You have to audition on your knees and you have to try to prove to a prospective employer that you'll be a good lackey. Right. And that's what they're auditioning you for, right? Can you
ask somebody, can you tell me why you really want to work at McDonald's? Why you really want to work the midnight shift at the DHL?
I'm really motivated, excited about it.
So you can't just say, well, I need the money.
Yeah. I'm willing prostitute.
I'm willing to do this. I mean, but yeah, I'm sorry. I guess this kind of demoralization.
You have to sell yourself. And they kind of train you to do that like it's normal and natural. But you don't actually have a choice fundamentally. And I guess the welfare state and some level of safety net in the West has hidden some of that from people, that there has been a fallback mechanism for some decades. But that was an anomaly. And that is being taken away. So we are once more returning to what things used to be, which is you don't work, you don't eat. And many times during economic crises in the past in Britain, people starved to death in large numbers. And that was just the normal workings of capitalism. And their ruling class would justify it by saying, oh, well, there's too many of them. Clearly, if they're not all employed, it's because there's too many and it's just nature's way that abundance.
And on that note, do you think we could, maybe we already have something similar, we just call it something different. But I know there used to be like poorhouses from the bourgeois point of view, or the WASP point of view, as we say in the States, focused on the moral failings of the working and poor classes. But do you think we could get something like that? Or something even more dystopian?
Would be at all prize, Tara, or they just find a different way to kind of do the same thing and give it a different label. But so I had a comrade who used to point out quite a while ago now how they'd actually reintroduced Victorian workfare, which was they brought in these training schemes and things where basically people on the dole being sent to Tesco's to work for their dole money. And what's that? The state is giving a subsidy to Tesco's by giving them basically free workers and paying them just enough to survive. So we can keep people at home, but do a similar thing that the workhouse did, which is keep them on a starvation wage and farm them out to employers. And the employers don't have to pay for them. The state pays this minimum wage bill. And another thing to subsidize wages for a long time, which is this thing called tax credits. Right? Which again is a way of letting employers pay below starvation wages, and then the state chops them up so you can just about live. We say thank you to the state, but we're the taxpayer subsidizing the profits of big corporations through these mechanisms, right? It's like housing benefit. It's a subsidy to landlords.
And in terms of what you said about the importance of having a scientific approach to this, or a scientific socialist approach to this, is that a lot of the things that get sold to us is to help the poor, to help the worker, to help whatever, we're just conduits. So I'm sure most of the people that get in this country, I think it's the universal credit, that goes into their bank account and then out to utilities, to rent, to food. But then it's like, oh, we're giving them this. It's like, no, actually what you're doing is what you just said, is that you're propping up or subsidizing market actors. It just goes through somebody's bank account. And they can still stay in their apartment, or they can afford the groceries. But it's just so, when you really think about it, just so nasty.
It's totally nasty. And it also, it's utterly demoralizing for the people involved in terms of their own character and their own life, because they become sponges rather than actors and agents in their life and in society. And that is a bad position for any person to be in. You know, as Marxists, we always say a person has one mouth to feed, two hands to work, right? We can produce far more than we need if we're given the opportunity. The problem with capitalism is it's incapable of giving us all useful work. That doesn't mean there isn't useful work to be done. The worst crime under a socialist society is people not being given useful employment, because there's so much that needs doing. We can easily employ everybody on, you know, decent wages, decent conditions, you know, to provide a much better life for everybody and for people to feel genuinely involved in the life of the productive life as well as the social life of the country and of the communities. So it's an utter waste, the most abominable waste, really obscene waste of human material that capitalism engenders, with this, what Marx referred to as the reserve army of labor, which is, of course, the unemployed, right? And capitalism needs the unemployed. It needs the unemployed to keep the workers, employed workers, disciplined. On the one hand, it keeps wages low. There's always, if you won't work, I can always find someone else who will work. And also, if there's a need to expand the workforce, you've got people hanging around waiting to be employed to expand and contract as required. So unemployment, mass unemployment, is built into the workings of the capitalist system from two directions. One was the capitalists impoverish the working class, and then the market kind of shrinks and the people are wherewithal to buy the products, and then the market shrinks. So you end up with people unemployed. And because the competition between big businesses creates technical innovations, and the technical innovations make workers redundant. So you have this from different directions. You have unemployment constantly being replenished, if you like, as capitalism progresses. So there's no way to abolish this waste of workers without abolishing capitalism. The best that the capitalists can come up with in some countries, like in the West, has been to say, well, we can't get rid of unemployment, so we'll pay the unemployed a small wage, not too much, but then the big employed looks a bit attractive. Enough that they don't starve in a ditch, because too many workers starving in a ditch makes the rest of the working class quite angry. Right?
And then it makes the good people feel bad, or it inconveniences them.
Makes the mass of the working class indignant. They feel that that's their fate when they fall out of work, just starve in the ditch. You know, that's gonna make them a lot more militant. So if you can keep the unemployed quiet and out of sight, then that's a good deal. But it was also a way of buying off the militancy of the working class after World War II. But that is, like I said, it's being taken away, and unemployment's becoming less and less survivable for many, many people.
Okay, so I'm going to combine the next two of the rubric of bourgeois proletarian role of the working class. This anti-workerism after the shock of fascism. So workers' authoritarian personality, then the Cold War in the 60s, and then this Chantal Mouffe third wave. There are all kinds of actors. So we have to decenter the worker, and that's where you get this kind of, you know, any kind of human right you're working on, any kind of norm you're trying to liberate people from becomes something that's of the left. And the workers, and therefore class, has gotten in the mix of the trinity of race, gender, and class get presented as if they're the same thing. And think of bell hooks. The focus of our ire is white supremacist, heteronormative, capitalist patriarchy. Yeah. And then you had the matrix of oppression, which had that. And then you had ableism and sexuality and maybe body positivity and, you know, furries, trans, all the stuff coming into that. So there's the combination of the decentering of the worker, the decentering of proletarian politics or class, this opening up of either it's wrong or backward to think of a quote unquote historical subject or a historical revolutionary subject, that space needs to be empty. Anything you want to say about that in terms of where all this stuff came from, how it gets confusing, and how to make sense of all this stuff, from class to class, race, gender, to matrix of oppression, to all the marginalized people and norms we need to queer. And that's what it means to be a leftist.
Definitely. Well, first of all, I'm going to do a plug. I wrote this little pamphlet called Identity Politics or Class Politics. It's an overview and a context for all of this that I think helps people to just navigate. So I don't go into detail about all the different stupid strands of idiocy, but give you a framework that hopefully you can navigate for yourself. And you can buy it from our shop, shop.thecommunists.org. But if you don't want to buy it, you can download it as a PDF from our website as well. So one way or another, the information is there for you if you would like to take a look at that. I would just like to point out that what we've seen in the modern period is the move into academia of struggles which used to be central to the socialist struggle for the emancipation of the working class. I said earlier about how the real mass women's struggle for liberation is tied to the question of class liberation. And so therefore, the question of women's liberation was a central plank in the socialist program of action. People who were really serious about fighting for women's equality joined the socialists, and we fight alongside working class men for class liberation, which will also be women's liberation, right? The struggle against racism is understood to be the struggle against imperialism. Imperialism needs racism, feeds racism at home and abroad all the time to justify its wars and to keep the population at home divided against itself. So it needs racism. It's endemic to an imperialist system to have racism. So if you want to get rid of racism, you've got to get rid of imperialism, which means capitalism, which means join the socialists, right? And fight black and white, fight together against the class system that is destroying all of our lives. This is the real content of a really anti-racist or a really women's liberation struggle. What we got was the bourgeoisification of those struggles to separate people who wanted to fight racism and people who wanted to fight for women's liberation from the communists, from the socialists, right? To separate them off little silos. So we got bourgeois nationalism and bourgeois feminism. And in both cases, what their demands boil down to, instead of trying to get rid of capitalism in unity with all other workers, they separate themselves into a special interest group and say, we need equality in this society. And that becomes their mantra, right? And I've talked earlier about how equality inside capitalist society is a mirage, it's an unattainable dream. So what does it really come down to? What it really comes down to is a fight over words, telling people off for having wrong attitudes within the working class, rather than helping them to see why we have a common struggle. And it's a demand for better off, more educated Black people or better off, more educated women to have access to the highest echelons of careers in the present system. And that's what equality looks like, right? This has been a hijacking of our struggle, essentially, and turning it into something completely different. And this is why I do not identify at all as a feminist. Right, I am a working class politician in the sense of, I do working class politics, and the working class politics for women, the battle for women's emancipation is a socialist battle. I'm going to also do for this book from our party.
Marxism and the Emancipation of Women. Yes.
And this documents women comrades who came a generation before me and who founded our party, their struggles in the women's movement when it was a truly mass movement. And they were fighting these bourgeois trends. And ultimately, they were not successful because they were a small group and they were overwhelmed by all the people who were peddling bourgeois nonsense into the movement. Massive working class women who had been mobilized into the women's movement were demobilized by all the crap that was like, burn your bra, kick the oppressor out of your bed. That was literally what
but wait, did they have abolished the family?
Right. So all of this nonsense.
Families are bad, especially those men folk.
So the working class women actually wanted to better their conditions as working class women, and the direction that the movement was going in alienated them, and they were basically demobilized. And the movement became one of petty bourgeois feminists who basically went into academia, Germaine Greer types.
This fits into the Your Party and Sultana when she proudly said that there's no room for quote unquote social conservatism in a socialist party. And so it's not enough to be tolerant. No, you have to be super excited and about every niche sexuality, every curiosity that used to be private that's now made into an identity. You have to be super, super excited about that, or F off, socialism is not for you. And I think for most people and for myself, it's easy to plot cultural stuff and then be like, oh, that's left or right. But when it gets into what we've been talking about, then it gets a bit more complicated or obscured, or this stuff obscures it quite by design. So what would you say? Is it possible to be conservative, to not be super excited about, furry, polyamorous, abolish the family types? Or, sorry, no room for you in the Communist Party?
Of course it's possible. In fact, there's a beautiful quote from Lenin in my little pamphlet where he talks about, and he tells off Clara Zetkin and some other German revolutionaries from about 1918 and says, this obsession with sex, he basically says, look, it's putting the cart before the horse. It's a ridiculous thing for a proletarian party to be engaging in when there's actual revolution happening on your doorstep. You've got much more important things to be doing. These are questions for the future, the questions of how will the family resolve itself? How will our relationships resolve themselves? First, you've got to get liberated and then find out how they resolve themselves, right? Now, when it comes to socialist demands, the platform is trying to help the working class achieve its liberation and build socialism. Our core platform is about how do we unite people around the most important demands of the working class. Now, to abolish racism and therefore abolish imperialism, to abolish the oppression of women and therefore class society, these are foundational planks of a Communist Party program. But every prejudice that's held in a society, every little marginalized group or people that feels that there's something...
Every kink, good Lord, sorry.
That's not even marginalized group. That's more difference. It's got nothing to do with economic status in society.
No.
And frankly, it's not something that anybody needs to bloody well know about. The idea that your sexual proclivities is something interesting to other people or liberating to yourself, it's utter nonsense. And it's the epitome of individualism, isn't it? We are trying to wage a class struggle to abolish capitalist production relations and instill socialist ones, right? The plan. And so the demands of our program are things which will further this aim and unite the working class around this program. We are against workers being discriminated against for any reason, whether it's to do with the old or the disabled or whatever. But that doesn't make it a central plank of our program for the pure reason that you can solve those problems inside capitalist production relations. For example, look what's happened. This society used to be massively homophobic, right? There were lots of laws and prejudice against gay people. Nevertheless, there were plenty of gay people in high positions of power, right? But they had to be hypocritical. It was kind of banned and all the rest of it. Those laws have all been overturned. Gay people have got the right to get married, the right to adopt children, all kinds of things. Did that stop capitalism? No. Therefore, gay rights are not a central plank of a Marxist program.
Well, they're a great market, yeah? Yeah.
It doesn't change the relations of this society. If our job is to change the relations of society, we have to focus our program on what's going to do that. So we're focused on anti-imperialism. We're focused on uniting the workers against the ruling class. We're not focused on little special interest groups. And we're certainly not focused on sexuality and sexual proclivities. It's utterly irrelevant to our struggle, apart from the commodification of women and children as a market under capitalism. Of course, we have to oppose that. We have to stand against pornography. We have to stand against prostitution.
Big fertility.
These are ultimate crimes against the working class of a class society, and we have to stand against those. But yeah, there's a lot of bourgeois individualism that tries to sell you the idea that prostitution and even pedophilia is somehow...
Are you saying that sex work isn't work?
Right. I'm saying it's not hard work. I'm saying it's against women, and we have to be opposed to it. If you say that the prostitution is liberating and acceptable in society, basically saying to men, working class, you want men and women to fight together for socialism, but you're saying to the men that they have the right to buy a woman's permission to have sex with her, i.e. to pay to rape her. I mean, just stop and think about that. How does that help us unify the workers to fight together for socialism? It's the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it becomes like the body shaming thing. Like, who are you to shame a prostitute? And I think some people think like this Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. And what I've always said to these people who are like sex workers work is, tell you what, why don't you go down to the dock or the truck stop and service the first 5 guys who want to pay you £10 for you know what, and then come back and tell us about how sex workers work.
And what a liberating choice that was.
Nobody has done it yet.
But of course they
That's the point. I don't really want them to. But
No.
it's just this,
And
it's
they're
just
not
still
going
an
to
odd
unless
thing.
they're forced to, which is the whole.
Yeah. And last thing before we wrap up, because this is going on right now, this kind of mind game. And you mentioned before that the serious socialist or communist parties that have the education, the tradition, the plan, don't get invited or don't get much press attention at all. But I'm sure you've picked up on the fact that already the UK lefty and is looking at Zach Polanski and Jeremy Corbyn or U parties kind of looking at the UK left like, what? You forgot us already? And the Greens had a good time at their conference. They feel radical. They said the idea was a terrorist organization. They said they want to abolish landlords. Is it true the Green Party has bold politics? And why is this guy getting his moment in the sun?
Well, it absolutely isn't true, is it? I mean, fundamentally, whenever the Green Party takes a really radical turn, and when it was first founded, it presented itself as being radical and far left of Labour. The roots of its politics are in anarchism, they're in Prudhonism. Fundamentally, they're in capitalism with kinder characteristics. And it's just a circus to keep people busy. That's why the ruling class will regularly wrap it up and throw it at you as, oh, you're looking for alternatives. Here's one. And look, the man looks quite pretty, doesn't he? So that helps. He's good in a suit. He makes a nice speech. Oh, he said abolish landlords. Well, great. Well, yes, I'm in favour of abolishing landlords and all rentiers and all owners of capital. How are we going to do that then? You're not going to do it by passing a law through the British Parliament, no more landlords. Right? There's no chance that you can do that, right? Because landlordism is the epitome of capitalism, right? Taking rents because you own stuff. That's how capitalism works, right? So what do they mean when they say, when you get to the nuts and bolts of it, how are they going to achieve anything? Their program is unachievable within the terms they've set for themselves. And if you wanted to achieve any of the good things these people say they stand for, you've got to go root and branch and abolish the system, which of course they do not stand for. And the Green Party, let's not forget, the Green Party in England and Wales, at least, I'm not sure about Scotland, supports the Ukraine war. They support NATO. So they're entirely a party of imperialism and defending British imperialism whilst wrapping it up, in some nice little phrases to attract people who are falling out of love with Labour and starting to draw the right conclusion that it doesn't matter who you vote for, you get the same outcome. So the idea is you give them your party, give them the Green Party, give them reform, make them feel like something new is happening when actually what you're giving them is the same.
Yeah, we have a saying in the States, no matter who you vote for, you get John McCain.
Right. Whatever party wins the election, ruling class is ultimately the winner. They stay in power. So that's the question we have to address.
First thing, I thought when I saw that, well, don't you have to get rid of the monarchy first if you're going to get rid of the landlords? And then I was thinking back to your comrade Alex McKay, and we were having a laugh, like how many Lennises or how many Liz Trusses would your party coalition last? To paraphrase what Alex said, the main problem with this Green Party thing or the Your Party thing is that either they don't know what they're talking about or they're on purpose not preparing people for what that would actually mean. So let's say that Jack Polanski somehow get enough votes and he was the head of this coalition against fascism and they think they're really in control. Let's start abolishing landlords. What would happen? When the landlords try to abolish you or the banksters or whatever, and the markets start to go crazy and people get scared, then people get disillusioned and think we really can't do that. They get the cart before the horse. They're starting where they want to end rather than how to get there, I guess.
Yes. They don't really understand what the real problem is. And that's really the point of most of these kind of very astroturf mass movements, is to keep the indignant part of the population that's starting to want to mobilize and really change things, keep them busy on something that can go nowhere, right? That's the point of it. And I tend to believe, it's not just that they get astroturfed in terms of promoted and a narrative created. I'm afraid I think that they are infiltrated from the start. If not very often the leaders themselves, but if not, then all the people around them advising them are basically state assets. And they are part of networks of people that are connected to various parts of the state to make sure they present a program that fundamentally doesn't question the causes of the problem, that keeps people hoping and believing that there's a way to reform the system into being fair and into delivering a better life for them. And yes, you're right. Very often, even then, the limited demands they're making, because we're in a time of such deep economic crisis, even those demands are not demands that the ruling class would really accept being put into practice. This whole thing with Corbyn, it was like his demands, some of them, he nationalised the railways and the water system. The Financial Times was running long investigations over how this would probably be a good idea. There's a big section of bourgeois society which is suffering from how bad privatisation has been, and a discussion about should some of it now be reversed. There's constant pieces in the FT about whether or not it's now time to start taking some of these privatised things back into public ownership in such a way that we can run them for the benefit, because business needs some of these services too, right? So some of his program was okay, but what was not okay was his official opposition to NATO. Well, they got him to turn around on that. His official opposition to Israeli Zionism. Well, he won't openly come out and say he's an anti-Zionist, because he actually isn't. But having been seen as the official left Labour friend of Palestine for 30, 40 years, it was kind of impossible for him to do the kind of use he would need to do to be an advocate of Israeli suppression of the Palestinian people. And that I think was really the big impediment to Jeremy Corbyn being allowed to win an election and pretend to deliver on one or two things like rationalising the water or the railways, right? Which they're sort of half doing, to the extent that they want to. Few things that were really likely to upset the ruling class they could have got him to turn around on, but the Zionism thing was the thing I think that was the big impediment. And I think really it would be a good education for people. It's annoying that they still need this after we've got so much experience. It'd be quite a good education for people to see in practice what would happen if Mr. Zach Polanski got into it's Polanski, isn't it? Have I got this thing right?
Zach Polanski. Yeah, it's not his real name. It's his legal name. But anyway, that's another story. Of course, Zach Polanski sounds, kind of mysterious. Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
yeah, I don't know. A U.S. example is the Zorhan Mondami. It looks like he's gonna, unless there's some, outside electoralism shenanigans, which is possible. He's pulling like 15-20% against what was that guy's name? Oh, Cuomo. But already, even though he's doing so good in the polls and he got a lot of support because of his position on Palestine, he still is sliding more and more into this, just as one example, his statement yesterday about October 7th didn't mention Palestinians at all and started off with Hamas's attacks, blah, 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 blah.
Exactly.
And so here's another example. He actually could win in New York, and then we'll see what actually happens.
He's auditioning to the ruling class. Let me in. I'll be a safe pair of hands. Yes, I'll say the odd radical thing, but I'm not really against your interests. So he's made statements against Cuba and Venezuela, statements against Palestinian resistance, statements, so he's actually making it clear. And of course, he supported the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad's Syria. So, of course, he supports NATO's war against Russia in Ukraine. Well, where's the radicalism actually in any of his positions?
It's his name. And his pedigree. Yeah, he's good on paper and he can talk well.
It will be interesting to see. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you're going to see AOC and Bernie all over again, aren't you? But let's say that Zach got into number 10. And with the Green Party majority, right, which is never going to happen. The parliamentary supermajority for the Green Party, and Zach had parliament and he was in office. It would be a good education for people to see that he would be just as much a servant of British imperialism as any of the others. He's already made it clear. His party's made it clear. It's part of why he's getting promoted, because he's already told the ruling class, yes, I'm your man, by supporting NATO, supporting its wars, supporting their version of green politics, which is just give subsidies to monopoly capital and they'll pretend that they're doing things to help the environment when they're not really. They're just propping up their profit margins.
Yeah. And the last thing I wanted to ask, and then I'm really going to let you go. Of course, you could leave on your own. Is that We mentioned how imperialism for both the UK and the United States, but not just them, but we use those two as examples. One of their main exports is capital overseas, and they want to get a return on that. You have to understand that to also understand the foreign policy, the military policy, all this type of stuff. But why that also matters in terms of workers of the world unite is that all that capital that could be reinvested or kept within the national boundaries, regional boundaries, gets taken out and put off everywhere. And then they get a lot of great tax policies when they quote unquote repatriate because they want that capital moving. So a lot of that is also why over time, even though it doesn't get discussed a lot from the quote unquote left or alternative media, you have such a steady decline of living standards and deindustrialization, all of that. I wanted to make sure that we connected that before we leave, that there's a connection between the conditions in a lot of places in the imperial core, for lack of a better word, with all the capital that's getting invested all over the place for the best returns.
Totally. And, you know, Britain being the first country of industrial capitalism was the first to begin the process of deindustrializing via the export of capital. So exported capital is the key economic indicator of an imperialist economy. They stop exporting manufactured goods to the world and they start just exporting capital to bring back profits. So they've built a machinery for sucking the wealth out of the world. But simultaneously, while they're doing that, they are exporting all the manufacturing jobs. So increasingly, and because that started in Britain in the 19th century, this process has been going on for like 150 years. So no wonder when you look around, you find it very hard to find a person who's engaged in making something. And yet we're using things all the time, but we don't make any of it. It's a very demoralized society that produces because eventually our entire economy has become parasitic. And most of us are paid to either do service jobs or to somehow help the machinery of financial looting of the rest of the world, right? So we have a very parasitic economy through no fault of our own. This is the inevitable workings of a capitalist economy on a global scale. And the only way to reverse that now and bring back a productive and meaningful economy to Britain is by abolishing imperialism and setting up, reindustrializing the country on a socialist basis.
And on that note, I think we've covered a lot, clarifying why the left-right binary or spectrum is problematic, because it tends to be the left wing of liberalism and the right wing of liberalism, left bourgeois, white bourgeois, even though, especially in the United States at this time, anything that's not Republican is far left. Schumacher and Pelosi, Biden, these crazy lefties. Kamala was on a talk show. They wheeled her out again, and she was calling Trump a communist dictator. But we'll get into that at a different time. Thank you so much. This has been great. I'll put Joti's information in the video comments when I get to that later today. Please do like, follow, subscribe. We'll definitely have Joti back, or I'll get her back as soon as I can. I know she's in demand, as you can tell by listening to her. She knows her stuff. Please do check out thecommunist.org. Do check out her two podcasts with Julian Vigo on Savage Minds. And are you doing the weekly thing? Is it a weekly thing with you and Garland?
Kind of goes up and down, but general, I'm with him on a Tuesday.
It's like an imperialist report. Great. And on that note, Joti, thank you. I'll let you go. I'm sure you have many things, many battles to fight and papers to write and all that stuff. I hope we can do this again sometime. Everybody, check out her deets in the details below. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Maybe I'll see you at a meeting at some point. Who knows?
That would be great.
Take care. Thank you, Joti.
Take care.
All right. So that was fun. That was a good one.